Hello, everyone. Welcome as you filed into the room. We can't see you filing into the room. I see people coming in. So, Belgian, do you want to start?
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Welcome from Law Foundation and Legal Aid BC to this year 2020's Provincial Advocate Conference. Due to pandemic, we all know that we are not able to see each other in person, which we all are missing, but we are thankful to God that we are able to do this training through this wonderful technology, and at least we will be able to hear each other, and whenever we want to, we'll be able to see each other through Zoom. So welcome to this 2020 Provincial Legal Aid Conference, which is possible due to this wonderful technology. We'll be starting the conference soon. As Lois said, that if you have any questions, there is a question and answers tab in the Zoom, and you can post your questions and answers there. But before we go to all the housekeeping tips, if you have any questions throughout the conference, we have a wonderful tech team. You can also contact me, Baljinder Gale. I am the Community Training and Outreach Coordinator with Legal Aid BC and Law Foundation. Lois Shelton, she's the Training Manager with Law Foundation BC. To start the conference, we are very blessed and we are very honored today. We have Gramma Joy with us. Gramma Joy is a Saskatchewan Cree elder who also has been adopted by Haida Nation, Raven Clan in Old Masset, Haida Gwaii. Gramma Joy was adopted when she was 5. Gramma Joy have immense experience working with all the community organizations, as she's a certified mediator and a certified clinical counselor. She has experience working with MCFD. She has traveled throughout the world to share her knowledge, her depth, her wisdom with many elders and many community organizations and communities. So please join me to welcome Gramma Joy. Thank you, Gramma Joy, and welcome to you as well.
Hi. Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me. It's such an honor and a blessing to be part of this, and so thank you for including me. The first thing I'd like to do is we traditionally honor the traditional unceded territory upon which we are situated, and in this particular instance, it is the Coast Salish people. And I would also like to acknowledge that the people of the Musqueam territory of the Musqueam Band are grieving today. They've lost an elder of theirs named Bud Sparrow, and I raise my hands to them in prayer and with heartfelt sympathy. So before we begin the prayer, I just want to let everybody know that I recognize my spirituality and my beliefs may not be the same as yours. And what I do in my life is I accept all the good that comes from the diversity of the many different faiths and spirituality and religions. There's good in all of them, and I embrace all of that. Please, I hope you don't feel when I start my prayer that I'm forcing this upon you. It's just what I do is, in a rather generic way, I give thanks for all that is good in our lives, and I pray for those who need healing in prayer. So, my name is Kaskitwe Apsisipiesu. I am from the Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. I was adopted when I was 5 and raised in the downtown east side until I was taken in by my non-Indigenous parents. As I got older, I was adopted again by the Haida Nation, and my name is Skilkatangas, which means fairy of knowledge. So here we go. I'm aware of the clock, so let us begin. Thank you for your patience. I like to close my eyes to just get grounded, and I always take a big breath in and out, and I let all the apprehensions and the worries about technology glitches and being on time and things that run our lives when we're not doing this, I just kind of put them in the back room for now so I can concentrate on what it is I'm supposed to do now. So here we go. Ichimanatu No to Eden, great creator of all good things. We are giving thanks today. We are giving thanks, first of all, for being available and able to participate in this very powerful audience of strong, influential people who are tasked and willingly go forth and help the people that need help. The oppressed, the downtrodden, the strong ones, the survivors, the thrivers, all of them out there, including ourselves. We give thanks for our strength. In the teachings of the 7 sacred teachings, which many of the nations from all around the world embrace, we consider love to be our driving force. We consider respect, which is earned and given, to be a powerful moving force in one of our teachings. We give thanks for our wisdom, our honesty, our truth, our courage to go forth, and above all else, humility. Humility is a huge one in recognizing, Creator, that we know, although we come from all 4 directions, the north, the south, the east, the west, we're from different cultures, we speak different languages, we look differently, we're all the same. Because, Creator, when you welcomed us into this world as we know it, we came in as innocent babes, innocent infants, and we're all equal, and we remain that way. So let us remember the powerful teaching of humility, that no matter what our title, no matter what our job, no matter what it is that we are tasked to do, we are all equal and we stay that way. Let us remember to be humble with that teaching. Let us give thanks for all of the ones who fly, the ones who walk on 4 legs, the ones who walk on 2 legs, and all of the good things, Creator, that you have gifted us with. The ones that we forget and seem to sometimes just take for granted, like the wind that blows through the sacred trees. The sun, when it can, shines through the clouds and the smog and the smoke. The blue sky when we can see it. The whispers of the wind, all of the good things. Let us not take them for granted, but most of all, Creator, let us remember the ones who, through no choice of their own, have ended up on something we call the black road. And the black road is not the red road. The red road is the gifted road where we feel the love and serenity and the courage and the energy and the power. And we're grateful for all the good things in our life. We're happy to be part of that. The black road, unfortunately, is for a lot of the people that have ended up there through no choice of their own, through things that have happened to them, through things that they have been born into. It is the road where they feel oppression. They feel not loved. Perhaps they cannot remember when they had their last meal or been offered a cup of coffee, or worry about their safety. And most of all, can't remember the last time someone looked them in the eye and said, I see you. I recognize you. I understand you. I am like you. I care about you. And I love you. Please remember that and go forward with strength and the courage to carry on. And one day, soon, hopefully, it'll be different and you'll be on the red road. Creator, let us pray for them. The ones whose hearts are filled with sadness, with grief, with loss, with no hope. The ones who are in institutions, perhaps in jail, perhaps in hospitals, sick and fighting the COVID-19 and other illnesses and diseases that make them feel weak. Creator, we pray for them all. So as we carry forward and we share our wisdom in the work that we're going to do today, and that we're gathered in numbers, there is strength. Creator, let us never forget those we are tasked to help with. We could be one of them. We have been one of them. Perhaps one day we will be, but we're not them. We're not them and us. We're all one. And we're gathered here in this circle today to do good work. And we pray, Creator, that you'll give us that strength and that we can feel your power in our hearts. And remember that everything we do is based and done with unconditional love. All my relations are whole. I am done.
Thank you, Gramma Joy.
Thank you, Gramma Joy. That is a wonderful start to the day. I hear there are practically about 113 participants, so we're well on the way to starting the conference. So for the next stage of our conference, I want to introduce Josh Paterson and Mark Benton QC, who will be providing updates about the Law Foundation and Legal Aid BC respectively. Josh Paterson is my boss. He's the ED of the Law Foundation. He's been my boss for a year. And before that, he worked at BC Civil Liberties Association for about 6 years as the ED there. And before that, he had a practice that involved constitutional law, First Nations law, labor, human rights, and other issues. And I just found out that in 2020, he was a joint winner of the Hillman Canadian Prize for Democracy and Social Justice for his work on human rights, which he never told us about. I'm also going to introduce Mark. No, it's a secret. We'll release it at the next staff meeting. I'd like to introduce Mark too, just so that I'm not popping in and out. Mark Benton QC is the CEO of Legal Aid BC, formerly Legal Services Society. He has been a lawyer since 1980 and worked many of those years with Legal Aid BC and the clinics that have been so important in our history. He has been the CEO of Legal Aid BC since 2002. His practice was in legal aid work, appellate work. He's worked as an adjunct professor at UBC. He's a past chair of the Legal Aid Plans of Canada and is a consultant with government and non-government groups on many access to justice issues. So clearly they both care about the work that we do, that you guys do, and I think it's helpful to get updates from them. So Josh, you go.
Thanks very much. Quick sound check. Lois, you can hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Lois. My name is Josh Paterson, and I use he, him, his pronouns. I want to welcome you all on behalf of the Law Foundation to the Provincial Training Conference for Advocates. I'd like to thank Gramma Joy for her remarks and her prayer, and acknowledge that we are gathered in different places around the lands now known as British Columbia, in the territories of Indigenous nations, territories in which Indigenous laws continue to exist and to have force. I'm personally sitting in the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And on behalf of the Law Foundation, we too communicate our condolences to the Musqueam Nation for the loss of one of their great leaders, Mr. Sparrow. The Law Foundation of BC is committed to doing its part to advance a just and a durable reconciliation between Indigenous peoples and others who have come to these lands afterwards. I want to thank Mark right off the top and Legal Aid BC, including all their staff, for their support, their joint support of this conference. It's really important, and neither of us could make this happen without the other, and I'm really glad to see that we've been able to pivot in this partnership in this really strange and not so much fun year to doing this online, and I certainly hope that in future years we may be able to once again meet together properly. I know that this has been a very trying year for all of you, and I want to take a moment to recognize just how difficult the pandemic has been. And I know that for many of you are the only person in your agency doing the kind of work that you do. So some of you can be isolated as it is, and then to physically then be isolated while trying to deal with people's problems is a really difficult challenge. And I want to recognize that we know that, and that we thank all of you for the wherewithal and the resilience that you have shown. And some of you maybe haven't felt that you had as much wherewithal or as much resilience, and that's okay too at this time. We certainly hope, while we're not your employers, we are the funder of these programs. We hope to be able to do as much as we can and to continue doing things to help as appropriate, to make sure you're all able to carry on your work in a good way that feels sustainable for everyone. The Law Foundation, most of you in the room will know about us from having come to these gatherings before, but I know that there are new folks as well. We're 51 years old this year, and we're the main organization in the province of British Columbia that provides grants for a variety of justice-related things, including law libraries, legal aid, law reform, legal research, and by far the biggest program, or the biggest kind of program that we support at the Law Foundation, are the advocacy programs, the programs that all of you form the backbone of. And there's a network of 50 poverty law advocacy programs around the province, assisting people with their problems, and a network of 25 family law advocacy programs on top of that, as well as clinical legal education programs at all the law schools, a variety of public interest law programs at certain specialized agencies. All of these agencies, we're so proud to be able to support. It is by far the lion's share of our grant budget every year. And this year, that has been added to with the opening of a new network of legal clinics, as I'm sure everyone knows, in what is a real collaboration between the province of British Columbia and the Law Foundation, in which we co-fund these new clinics, with the province contributing funding for staff lawyers and legal support staff, and us combining our existing funding for the legal advocacy programs. In total, there are 7 new clinics, 4 poverty law clinics, and 3 specialized clinics in disability law, in tenancy, and in immigration and refugee law. Certainly we know that that isn't enough. While during COVID, there's quite appropriately been a lot of conversation about different ways of improving access to justice that don't necessarily require the involvement of lawyers, and all of your work is a huge testament, and probably the most advanced, one of the most advanced examples in the English-speaking world of a network of non-lawyer legal advocates assisting people with legal problems. While all of that is super important, there still need to be, as you know, lawyers that can be turned to when things become more complex, or one has to go to court, etc. And so it is important for these investments to be made, and we're quite grateful to the province of BC that they had the foresight to do that. Thinking about this terrible year we've been having and the importance of your work, Mark will probably have more information about this, but LABC, with support from the Law Foundation, had commissioned a survey of regular people's legal needs during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I won't get into it very deeply, but just over a third of the respondents in this study said that the legal problems that they were experiencing were directly caused by COVID-19 or were made worse by COVID-19. And I'm sure all of you in your work know the direct impacts that COVID-19 pandemic has had on people's lives, on people's employment, on their tenancy, on their family relations, on keeping people during lockdown in difficult family situations that otherwise they might seek to leave, and all of the spin-off effects of that. We know, and we now have documented that all of the problems that folks experience are made worse by this pandemic. And so the work that all of you do under these difficult circumstances is so vital in trying to remedy these issues that people are coming forward with. And we're just so grateful that you're out there doing that. One of the things that folks were saying in the survey is that a lot of times they're not getting any help with their legal problems because they don't know what to do. They don't know where to go. It's too stressful for them to think about it. They think nothing can be done, and the cost, obviously. And while legal advocates can't and don't serve everyone and are, usually full to the brim in terms of capacity, every person that you help is a way of helping with those problems, is a way of reducing that burden on society that ultimately creates better outcomes, better health, better education, better lives, and better futures for people in this province. So we're deeply grateful for your work. We know it's difficult and that you're highly skilled and caring people doing your best, and we really appreciate it. A little bit about the Law Foundation and our current situation before I pass over to Mark, if I may. Over the past year, we consulted with our advocate and our lawyer community about what they think the Law Foundation needs to prioritize, what we need to work on over the next few years. One of the things that we heard about strongly was about a lot of human resources issues. And last year I said we were going to be working on those issues. This year I'm able to say that we have been working on those issues, and we are launching a human resources sustainability strategy for the sector. We're piloting a number of programs with different agencies to see how they work, to try and make sure that various of our funded agencies have access to better human resources supports than they've had in the past. And there's a lot more work to come on that. We've not been immune in Canada to issues on racial justice. Those issues are run deep in our society, racial injustice in the justice system in particular. And the Foundation has been talking with folks this year, even prior to the issues that arose in the United States, to see what it is that we can do to invest in that more here in the province of British Columbia. And I expect that you'll hear more about that in the months to come. And that's all the more important in the pandemic as well, because it's clear that the negative impacts of the pandemic fall disproportionately on racialized and Indigenous communities here in BC. Our income at the Law Foundation is the product of the interest rates on lawyers' trust accounts. And for those of you who've been following economic news, interest rates fell dramatically after the COVID-19 pandemic began to really historic lows. And so our income has taken a very large hit, and we're working on how to manage that. This year it won't be as bad as we thought, because trust balances, the amount of transactions that are taking place with lawyers and law firms, haven't fallen in the way that we predicted that they might during this recession. But we're still going to have a lot less income than we did last year. We are protected against that to a certain extent because we have a very good grant stabilization fund that right now has more than 3 years worth of grants in it. It's quite robust. And so our priority over the next year to 2 years is figuring out how to make sure that we can best support all of our grantees in the context of a financial situation where our income might not rebound very quickly. That's happened before in the 2009 recession. We were able to do quite a bit actually, and spend a lot of money out of our reserves to support the ongoing provision of services. And we're optimistic that we're going to be able to do the same thing this time. I'd like to thank Lois Shelton at the Law Foundation and Baljinder Gill and others at both of our agencies for all of the work that they've done to bring this together today. It looked really great on the scheduling app. I was really, really impressed, and I hope that it works really well for everyone. I hope you all have a great conference. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Josh. And welcome, everybody. I've been doing these welcomes now since 2002. And seen an awful lot of stuff in between those. I think that often the overriding theme of my comments tend to be around access to justice. It's an issue that I continue to be deeply interested in and committed to. And I just want to give you a bit of background on Legal Aid BC. Some of you will recognize that we used to refer to it as Legal Services Society. It still remains that organization legally, but basically we rebranded based on what our clients told us was interesting. And Josh just referred to some of the work we've been doing to try to discern what people feel the primary needs are right now. And there's 2 studies that are available that have only become available in the last couple of weeks. One is the survey that Josh referred to. The other one is a consultation that happened in communities across the province over the past year. Both the survey done by Centus and the community consultation include the COVID period. So it gives you a sense of what's happening right now, and it's on the LSS website under reports. You can get it there, and if we'll make sure that those links are available to you. As with all the other research we do, we publish it all on the website, so you'll see historic comparability there with past surveys. But the surveys really raise a point that I think is central to what we need to be doing when we look at access to justice. At Legal Aid BC, we have a statutory mandate that has 3 big things included in it. The one, and the obvious one that you probably might think was there, was to run an efficient, effective legal aid plan, but there are 2 others. The first one is to assist people to resolve their legal problems and to facilitate their participation in the justice system. The second is to advise the Attorney General on legal aid and access to justice. So a lot of our work tends to have more of a systemic focus for those 2 reasons, right? The provision of legal aid is often a really reactive function. The other 2 functions are really about design and an intersection with people to help them with their problems, just as each of you does every day. So some of the stuff there, while it's focused on legal aid delivery, will be of general application. I was grateful, as I always am, to have Gramma Joy start us today in a good way. I was reminded as she spoke about the Black Road and the Red Road, that the system, the justice system as a whole and its institutions can often find themselves on one of those 2 roads. That virtually all of us who are gathered around our screens today to talk about how to do justice better for people are committed to a red road approach for both for our clients and more broadly for the system. It's what drives us to do it, I think. And I'm a little bit concerned right now that a lot of the work is really to sustain a system that wasn't serving low and middle income people well. Low and middle income people, all those surveys tell us, including the one that you can look at that we just did, that what people want when they have a legal problem is a response that's fair, authoritative, reasonably timely, reasonably inexpensive, and reasonably transparent. And in Canada, we're really good at transparent, fair, and authoritative, at least in the justice sense. We are terrible at reasonably inexpensive and reasonably timely. And trying to come up with better ways to do that is something that the system has generally failed to do over the last 50 years. I believe strongly that your experience is part of the solution to that. Your day-to-day work with people is exactly what people want. They don't necessarily want a lawyer to help them. They want somebody to help them. They want somebody who's knowledgeable and skilled. It doesn't mean they don't want lawyers. They just want help. How we provide that help is appropriately diverse. Right? Different people have different needs at different times and need different services to help resolve them. You're expert in that. It's what we do as a group. And as we come together at these annual meetings, there are important opportunities to share experience, to share what's working, to share what promising practices are available to each of us as we do that work, and to build the networks that we need to do it well together. One of the pieces that fits well and has fit better than ever is our ability to communicate virtually and to have virtual discussion groups and do this work. I like Josh, am so impressed at the work Belginder and Lois and respective teams have done to make happen in a way that brings us together, I think, in important and new ways, and I think will help us find new paths forward to how we collaborate on this work. I want to acknowledge, too, the work of the foundation under its shift in leadership, and how impressed I've been at the stalwart support that Josh and his team at the foundation have had to supporting these programs and maintaining them in some of the most dire financial circumstances that any of us have ever seen. I think Josh knows this, but I'll say it publicly here. It was an important place and position for the foundation to take to maintain support for programs, notwithstanding a real crash in the funding and a real disruption in our ability to predict what revenue is going to look like over the medium and longer term. While there's no guarantees about what will happen next, I do want to point out a couple of things that are in relation to this. Is that the uncertainty around the economy is going to be in place for quite a while. As you've probably figured out, interest rates are going to be low for quite a while. These are all going to be pressures on the foundation that will mean that all of us, legal aid, every one of your programs, will likely be looking at pretty, in best case scenario, steady state in terms of resources available. And at the same time, we can reasonably anticipate the number of problems is going to increase. And as Josh indicated, and the severity of those problems will increase. And the severity includes how they affect people's lives on a day-to-day basis, the stress they feel, the marginalization they experience, and more broadly, I think the economic implications for them and their families. You are often the only resource they have, those families, those people, to respond in a way that gives them some control over their circumstance and I think some dignity in the Canadian society in terms of what happens next in their lives. I think the model that has developed in BC in terms of a mix of lawyers and community advocates is a really important one for how it supports people developing the capacity to address legal problems on their own and with guided support. It's a big and important thing that I think will serve us well as we move forward, but it's going to put more pressure on you. And so these kinds of shared moments where we get to talk about experience and promising practice are particularly valuable right now. There's one other big issue that flows from this, and that is that you know what people need, or we together know what people need. I think each of us on our own probably can't claim that. But together, it's important that the voices of our clients be heard, both through us as intermediaries and through our support for them to be heard directly. There's lots and lots of justice system stuff happening right now. And Josh and I find ourselves in meetings together almost every week with a bunch of other notables. But there's no client voices there. There's no people's voices there. They're justice system stakeholders. They're justice system leaders. And indeed, we all have a responsibility to make sure that the system is working well for British Columbians. And that's all reasonably well on track, not moving as fast or as simply as I think many of us would like. But as we look at shaping a system that serves people better, there needs to be a stronger client voice. There needs to be a better understanding of what people want and need. And while I know, and I echo Josh's concern, that all of us are pressed to the limits of our resilience, taking a systemic view is deeply important right now. It's deeply important to engage in the changes that are happening. It's deeply important to help our client groups engage where we can. Now, nobody asked me to say any of that stuff. And let me fulfill my obligations and tell you what's new at LABC, because none of what I've just told you is new. In fact, I think these issues are simply amplified by COVID-19, but they'll continue to be amplified. And there is an opportunity right now for voices to be heard. in ways that may shape how things evolve in the near future. Okay, so the survey that Josh referenced asked the question, have you experienced a serious and difficult to resolve problem in the last 3 years? It's a survey that we typically do every 5 years, so some of those questions were designed to be consistent with past ones, so you can see how numbers have changed, which Josh referenced. I think what always surprises me is the numbers are so high. In fact, they're higher than they are in the rest of the country. Typically, they sit around, in this report, typically they sit around 75 to 80%. They were over 80% to 83%, I think, for this survey. It's a big deal, right? Legal problems are a part of everybody's life. I know you know this. I know that you've got more demands for service that you can provide, but it's a key piece in terms of who we are as Canadians and how we work. And so what we've been doing at Legal Aid BC is responding on a number of fronts. One is responding particularly to the court backlogs with the courts closed. People who, with emergency family matters, haven't been able to get assistance. Within the next 2 weeks, there'll be announcements about more broadly available family legal aid that will basically give almost everybody a lawyer for up to 10 hours, I think, is what we're currently able to afford, to try to get the backlog cleared and to assist people with their problems. This will be helpful because if you've got somebody who was refused legal aid in the last year or so, you'll probably want to tell them for family legal aid, want to tell them to get back in. We've enhanced criminal legal aid availability to deal with backlog clearance initiatives. There's a new online mediation service for maintenance variation. This is a guided pathway coupled with online mediation that's free. So you've got clients who are dealing with that. Those will be particularly helpful for people newly where the paying partner is newly unemployed, or where the paying partner is newly employed, right? In either of those cases, they may be relevant services. Most of you will have seen our COVID newsletter on changes. Not surprisingly, the MyLaw BC wills provision has been our most popular guided pathway in the pandemic. It continues to be available. Wills are important for many people's lives. If you've got clients who don't have them, just direct them there. It works well. And so, Lois, that sort of covers the waterfront. I've spoken to what I think is the need for some collective action and to share the knowledge that we have to support broader system change. Legal Aid BC has many new services that are designed to meet current needs, but these are continuing to evolve. I think many people now, and certainly me, think that this is going to be a multi-year circumstance, both for the economic fallout as we look at more people being unemployed, and what it's like for our first recession in Canada, where we've got mostly women who are becoming unemployed, where in the past we've had mostly men, and I'm not sure what that's going to mean for legal problems, but I know that we'll find out and undoubtedly talk about it this time next year. Thanks so much.
I have a question in the Q&A. So please give more information on guided pathway to creating a will.
Could you hear that, Mark? More information on guided pathways to create a will?
Actually, yeah, the best way to get there about the guided pathway on the will is on the MyLaw BC site. Just Google MyLaw BC, you'll get there. There are guided pathways on how to respond in the face of a foreclosure when you can't afford your mortgage. There's one on how to do a will. There's one on how to do a separation agreement for partners. And there's one on developing a domestic violence safety plan. Not surprisingly, domestic violence safety plans up too. So those are designed for people to do on their own, but it's also one of those areas where some clients would, I'm sure, welcome assistance. It's only, among other reasons right now, only available in English as we continue to work out how guided pathways work. For those of you who aren't familiar with them, they just ask a series of questions. It's not artificial intelligence. It's just a structured branch and twig system that leads clients to a will that will work for them. Only does simple wills, but does about 26 variations. So generally useful, by far the most popular of the MyLaw BC offerings. Hope that's helpful.
Can I add to this? This is Baljinder. There is a full session on September 22nd on Legal Aid BC resources, where Nate will be presenting on MyLaw BC tools and how to use them. So please log into that session to get detailed information on how to make a will on MyLaw BC, and as well how to use the other services and resources on MyLaw BC. I hope this is helpful. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I am currently trying to phone. Do I still sound robotic?
Yeah.
Okay. I am. Sorry, give me 5 minutes. Just give me 2 minutes.
Sure. While you're doing that, Lois, I just want to say that the things like MyLaw BC are how Legal Aid BC uses its law foundation funding, its notary foundation funding, in order to support additional services. This is probably obvious. They're not anything that looks like a traditional legal aid program. In fact, they marry up legal aid with public legal education in new ways that we're learning quite a bit from, and have helped us get a better understanding of what's actually helpful to people, and the range of service. So I, as much as I am a proponent of making legal services available online for people, I come from a background, as virtually all of you do, that's about face-to-face service. And one of the things you'll find in both the survey that we've done and the community consultation is, and so does everybody else. Right? It's not just a matter of replacing services with digital services. It's a matter of using digital services in a way that complement face-to-face services, and it's what we continue to be committed to. One of the things that's come along with that wills guided pathway, as we heard from the legal aid plan in Fiji, who actually had a government grant to do wills for everybody, which was a marvelous government grant to get. I think supported by the UN, and what they were keenly interested in is whether they could lift that program and do it. And we're still working with them and hoping that they'll be able to develop something that will allow us to learn from them about how they can do digital delivery in basically a non-digital society. So Lois, I was just kind of filling some space until your mic came up again. How do you want to proceed?
One thing that I had cut out of what I had said at the top that might be worthwhile talking about right now is some of you will be familiar with the Law Foundation's Truth and Reconciliation Commission Action Plan from 2016. We were one of the first funders in the country to actually come up with an action plan. But one of the consequences of having done so early is that there's really been a lot of change between 2016 and now on those issues that isn't reflected in our current implementation plan as it stands. So the Law Foundation, as part of its strategic planning over the next year, is in a process of trying to take a deep look at its TRC implementation plan, trying to look at what it is that we're doing and how we are contributing as a foundation and as part of the justice sector to the broader project of reconciliation, taking into account the new legislation at the provincial level that requires the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples into BC law, and taking into account the recommendations of the federal national inquiry on murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. So there's a fair bit of work and consultation that we're going to be going through in that process. One of the ways, a few of the ways in which we're acting under the plan as it exists is, some of you might have seen in the news, This was an investment that we made long before COVID took place, but we're very proud to be supporting the creation of a national center for Indigenous law at the University of Victoria. We were one of basically the founding donor for that program that allowed their program there, which works in Indigenous laws as Indigenous law, as opposed to Canadian law and BC law under the Indian Act. They're doing work in the realm of Indigenous law, really leading the world in terms of the depth and the breadth of the work that they're doing there at the University of Victoria. That is a key investment for the future that the foundation committed to a few years ago, and that's just sort of starting to come to fruition now. They're hoping to have shovels in the ground soon. The other thing that's going to start changing the shape of the way legal services are delivered over the coming years is the new First Nations Justice Strategy, which was jointly agreed at a high level by the province and the BC First Nations Justice Council. The foundation had nothing to do with the generation of that plan other than to provide some financial support to come up with the plan, but we're certainly nowhere close to authoring it, running it, no influence at all other than just trying to be a supportive, really background partner. But a number of the recommendations in there include, for example, recommendations to open Indigenous justice centers around the province, which we don't know exactly how that is going to look. COVID has changed what the hoped for implementation was of that plan, but there are already some of these centers that are opening in locations such as Merritt and Prince Rupert and Prince George. The hope and expectation is that there will be more. Over the coming year and years, these are new services that I'm positive that all of your services will have cause to interact with because they're going to be operating in your communities. And there'll be lots more to come on that. And again, as I said, we don't know entirely what the shape of that will be. And there'll be lots of work to be done to work out the relationship between those new programs and the existing programs, both under LABC's umbrella and under those that are funded by the Law Foundation. But it's an exciting new development to really look hard at making real change to the way that Indigenous folks in the province interact with the Crown's justice systems. Lois, you're back.
I'm back. What do I sound like?
Oh, crystal clear.
Oh, do I? Good. Great. Sorry. Anyway, now I know what it's like to be locked out. Thank you, both of you, and thank you for riffing and filling in so nicely. Kasari will be here in a matter of minutes. She's coming in a bit early, so it's all working out perfectly. But I did want to add to Josh's thanks to me and Baljinder. Thanks to the people who make the tech work this year. We always have more than just me and Baljinder. Sue Bradley from LABC and Alessia Mordini at Legal Aid BC. Did I just say? And Legal Aid BC is Alessia, are always part of the team. But this year we've had a larger team because it's more work. So Kayla Black and from Law Foundation and Sarah Chow from LABC have really been doing a lot. We meet every week and we think of everything that can go wrong, just so that most things will go right. So thank you to all of them for being part of this long process. Fun, but long. The other thing I want to just encourage people is to register in sessions that are coming up. I know there's a lot of them. If you can't meet some of them, they're recorded, but we do encourage you to come and try and attend them live if you can. The recordings will not be available until after this conference, until the end of November. Any of you out there who have law degrees or know people who have law degrees, we've got CPD credit for this, so that's good for lawyers. I think that's about it. I guess the last thing to say is that we have had extra people asking, like co-workers of people asking to join this year. And because it is a virtual conference, we can do that this year. Hopefully next year we'll be in person, and then we'll be back to sort of more regular numbers. But if there are other people in your office who are interested in particular sessions, they should feel welcome to join. So now, Kayla?
We apologize to everyone that we're not able to deliver the usual selection of cheeses, strawberries, and other stuff at the tables, which I know is, in addition to being good eating, is also an important gathering place to talk with folks. And that's, I think, what we'll all really miss from this year's conference, is that ability to have crosstalk and to build those connections. And so we hope we'll be able to get back to that, not just because of the cheese and crackers.
Great. So I see from the little notes behind the team that Kasari is ready to speak. So can I leave that to you, Josh, once we find Kasari's photo for you to introduce her? Good.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Once she pops in.
I'm here.
Hello.
Hi.
Welcome, Commissioner Govender. The task happily falls to me to introduce you, Commissioner, so if it's okay with you, I will proceed with that. And then you can let her rip. Thank you so much, Commissioner Govender. Kasari Govender took office as BC's first independent human rights commissioner just over a year ago. So happy Commissioner birthday to you, belatedly. I guess a very merry unbirthday, because we've missed it by about a week. And her role as commissioner is to lead the promotion and protection of human rights in BC through her office. Commissioner Govender has devoted her life to promoting human rights with a focus on the rights of those who are the most marginalized and vulnerable. From the Law Foundation's perspective, she was a staff lawyer and then executive director of West Coast Leaf from 2009 to 2011. Incidentally, we started our careers as lawyers at Law Foundation of BC grantees the same year, and I'm very grateful to have been able to work with the Commissioner prior to her appointment on many issues to promote equality, fairness, and human rights all through that time. Commissioner Govender was really a wonderful choice for BC's first Human Rights Commissioner under the new HR Commission regime. She's a deeply thoughtful and powerful advocate, and ever since her appointment, she and her amazing team that she has assembled have been had their foot on the gas pedal and have been pushing really hard in a way that we needed for such a long time. One cannot overstate the importance of having a position like Kasari's and having someone in the role like Commissioner Govender to be able to constantly push government on issues of equality and injustice. Just 2 days ago, the Commissioner released a very important report calling for new legislation to require government researchers to collect data, data on the racial identity of folks, disaggregated data in the service of systemic equality. The Commissioner's office has recognized that you cannot fight systemic discrimination if you don't actually know what you're doing. And many of us I know out in the advocacy community and in the public interest law community have dealt with perfectly well-meaning government agencies where we think that there's discrimination going on and they say there isn't. And when we ask them to show us why they know that, they don't have any data to support that. And when asked why they don't have any data, I've literally myself had answers like, well, we're colorblind about these things. We know that that's actually how you create an environment for systemic discrimination to thrive, those kinds of responses. So I'm hoping we may hear more about that today. And I'm just so happy to welcome Commissioner Govender back. She was a veteran of this conference prior to her appointment, and since her appointment, she's now 2 years into a streak of appearing here. So I hope that we can maintain that unbroken streak, I'm sure it will be when Commissioner Govender finally leaves the office, if she's able to say that she had an unbroken streak of coming to these conferences, it would be one of the signal achievements, I hope, that she could look back on. So over to you, Commissioner Govender. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks so much, Josh. I think that's the best introduction I've had since I started this role. So that was wonderful. Thank you so much.
We aim to please.
Always a pleasure to be back in the Law Foundation fold. So thank you for the invitation here today. And thank you to those of you who are watching and joining. I think it's during this such an unusual time, it's that much more important to find ways to connect and to learn. Because while, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic is very, very strange and a very difficult time, it's also a crucial time to be talking about human rights. And from my perspective, human rights are never more important than in times of crisis, because it's precisely when they're the hardest to fulfill that they're the most important to fulfill. And in these challenging times, it's critical for us to know our rights, to understand the scope of protections of our rights here in BC, to place human rights at the center of our decision-making, and also to continually educate ourselves, to acknowledge our own biases and seek out the education we need to continually confront those biases. So thank you for joining me in that journey. I want to acknowledge that I'm here in Vancouver, which is on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And in the tradition of some of BC's First Nations, a territorial acknowledgement is more than just an acknowledgement of whose territory we're on, but also a means of introducing ourselves or introducing myself in relation to this land and to the work I do on it. So in that spirit, I want to just take a moment to do exactly that, introduce myself and the work I do. So I come to this work and to this place from migrants and settlers from all over the world, or from various places in the world. I come to this work from a family shaped by the forces of systemic racism. My father grew up Indian under apartheid system in South Africa, and that was a significant influence on my understanding of systemic racism. I also come to this work from a long line of social justice activists, including a mother who spent her career working on violence against women and children, working to address violence against women and children. And it's out of this context that I've spent the last, I keep saying decade, but it's actually much more than that now, working to address human rights in all forms, including I spent much of my career working on gender equality issues. And it's out of this context that I now find myself in this role as BC's Human Rights Commissioner. So I offer these introductions as a means of placing myself in context in these lands and on this work and in relation to the work that you all do in community, and as a means of saying thank you to the Coast Salish peoples who have cared for this land for so many generations. So today I want to spend my time with you talking about BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, how we were established, what makes us unique, what our priorities are for my term as Commissioner, and what we've been up to most recently. As you just heard from Josh, earlier this week we released a major new report calling for the collection of race-based and other disaggregated data in order to effectively address systemic inequality. So I will in particular spend some time on that area and talk about that area of our work. But before I get there, I'll talk a little bit about who we are. I did do this last year, but I was maybe a month or so into my term. So I think I hope my way of talking about this and thinking about how our thinking has evolved over the last year. So my mandate is to address inequality, discrimination, and injustice in BC through shifting laws, policies, cultures, and institutional practices. And we do this, we have a variety of tools at our disposal to do this, including education, inquiry, monitoring, research, and advocacy. I'll talk a little bit more about what, I'll give some examples about each of those areas. We do this work in service of human rights as defined by the Human Rights Code. So that is discrimination in the context of employment, of housing, of service provision, of union membership, and what's called publications, which is a bit of a misnomer, but the section in relation to hate speech. Those are the areas that the Human Rights Code covers, and that's my mandate. But in addition to that, we also do this work in relation to the much broader spectrum of international human rights protections, and I'll get more to that in a moment. My office fits into the three-part system of human rights in BC, the Human Rights Tribunal, of course, which hears and adjudicates and settles human rights cases, much like a court would. There's the BC Human Rights Clinic, which provides legal advice and legal assistance to those seeking to resolve their individual cases. And so while these other aspects of the system have been continually operating, what's been missing from that system for 17 years was a body or a mechanism that was tasked with addressing systemic concerns. Aside from, of course, the many civil society organizations that did that work, but there was no comprehensive public body that was charged with doing the kind of examination into systemic inequality that we so need in this province. And that's really the looking into the public policies, institutional practices, or cultural norms that act to perpetuate or support the perpetuation of human rights abuses. My role is set up as in a unique way under the BC Human Rights Code. So first, I'm appointed as an independent officer of the legislature, which means I don't report to government or to a ministry, but instead report directly to the legislature. And so I'm tasked with monitoring and acting as a watchdog for human rights in the province. That means that both my appointment and the budget process are both removed from the partisan processes of government and are both established by all party legislative committees. In the present context of a minority government, that's particularly all partisan or non-partisan, whichever way you want to see that, in that they're quite balanced committees. So I was appointed by a committee of 2 Liberal MLAs and 2 NDP MLAs, and they had to agree unanimously on my appointment. Second, unlike all other human rights commissions in the country, except for the Ontario Human Rights Commission, my office is focused entirely on systemic change. We have no gatekeeping or triage role with incoming human rights complaints, nor do we play any role in adjudicating complaints. So really my only role in with the individual complaint system is as a potential litigant. Third, as I've mentioned, we have a broad mandate to promote compliance with international human rights law. So that really opens up the kinds of rights that we can grapple with in our work, including economic, social, and cultural rights. So the tribunal is restricted to applying human rights as defined by the Human Rights Code, and the tribunal is the other body that's set up by the Human Rights Code. And they are sort of within the 4 corners of the Human Rights Code and how they have to define human rights. So that's, to put a finer point on that, they work with non-discrimination on the basis of a number of personal characteristics such as race and disability, and in the specific areas, again, of employment and tenancy and so on. But we are not so restricted. We're not restricted in working only on issues of equality, though of course that is a very significant focus of our work. And we are also not restricted to the grounds listed in the code. So while discrimination on the basis of poverty or social condition is excluded from the protections of the code, and therefore excluded from the purview of the rest of the human rights system, we can work on these issues because economic rights are protected in international law. So there's some significant differences really from other human rights commissions in the country and from the Human Rights Tribunal. These 3 aspects of our structure make us unique in Canada and in BC's history, and uniquely position us to focus squarely on systemic change. We have a number of tools under the legislation to address this kind of shift, including education, research, policy and law reform, interventions, test cases, and inquiries. So the latter, inquiries, is a new addition to our tool belt. While it passed in part of the original package of changes to the Human Rights Code that created the Commission, year and a half, almost 2 years ago, it didn't come into force until September 1st of this year. So we are right now working on articulating what our first inquiry will be into, and doing some feasibility studies on some key issues that we think may be the focus of that tool to start out with, at least. So what have we been doing with all this unique setup that we have? Well, I am 1 year, as you've heard, I'm 1 year into my 5-year mandate, and we have spent the last year building the organization. We've grown from 2 people last September to 17 people now, and we're in the process of hiring 13 more. Lots of job postings on our website, so for anybody who's interested. Building an organization from the ground up is not without its challenges during a global pandemic, but we are determined to build a sustainable, healthy organization that not only reflects human rights values and the human rights mandate we have from the inside out, but also is set up in a sustainable way that can stand the test of time and the whims of government. BC has had 4 different human rights commissions over the last 51 years that it's had human rights law legislation, and many years in between with no commissions at all. There were 2 large periods in BC's history where we just had no human rights commission. So one of my objectives during my term is to ensure that this time the commission sticks. And to this end, we've developed 5 strategic priorities for the years ahead. Of course, the core of our work will be acting as a watchdog on the implementation and fulfillment of the Human Rights Code. I shouldn't say will be, it is acting as a watchdog on the implementation and fulfillment of the Human Rights Code. So a focus on systemic equality in the context of employment, housing, and services that are usually available to the public. In addition to that core foundational priority of our office, we're also focusing on decolonization, poverty as both a cause and effect of inequality, the rise of hate and white supremacy, the human rights of those who are detained by the state, whether that's through the criminal justice system or the mental health system. So for example, in the area of poverty, we have been advocating for the provincial government to amend the Human Rights Code to include discrimination on the basis of social condition, which would include poverty and homelessness. We have also been advocating for the inclusion of indigeneity as a prohibited ground of discrimination under the code to further the goals of decolonization. While there have been successful human rights complaints filed by Indigenous people about discrimination based on race, the Human Rights Tribunal has identified, rightly so, that despite the vast human rights issues and inequalities that Indigenous people face in the province, that they infrequently bring complaints to the commission and to the tribunal. The tribunal commissioned a report from Ardith Wacom that was released at the beginning of 2020, and that report identified the many ways in which Indigenous people feel excluded from the system, and one of them was the lack of naming of indigeneity within the code. So we have been working alongside the tribunal to push government to amend the code to include that ground. In the areas of hate and racism, in 2 weeks, we are launching a cross-provincial awareness campaign to encourage people to reflect on our internalized racism and learn how to take steps to be an anti-racist. So keep your eyes out for that. And in the area of detention, we are working right now on submissions to government about their proposed reforms to the Police Act and how to embed a human rights framework into that context. In other words, providing some recommendations about how to tackle systemic racism in policing. So of course, all of our work has taken on a much sharper focus in this time of pandemic and protest, which I'm sure many in the audience can relate to. COVID has amplified racial tensions and fueled hatred, extremism, and the rise of authoritarianism. The virus is exacerbating poverty, homelessness, hunger, mental illness, and domestic violence. The rights of children and youth are being challenged as educators race to find safe options for access to schooling, while people with disabilities are experiencing even greater poverty and isolation. Unemployment has spiked, and data shows that young people and women, particularly women of color, are bearing the brunt of unemployment. We know that human rights abuses, racism, and discrimination occur daily, and the extraordinary times we are in merely highlight our society's inequalities. The onset of the pandemic has increased the scope of our work. We are called on to issue human rights protections, or human rights policy recommendations, I should say, to correctional services, public health officials, employers, and duty bearers, all to ensure they are protecting human rights amidst this sudden global health crisis. In this moment of crisis, the world as we know it is shifting beneath our feet. People have taken to the streets. The calls to address systemic racism in our institutions, particularly police, have become louder. And in that context, on June 5th this year, I joined human rights commissions from across the country in calling on all jurisdictions in Canada to start collecting race-based and other disaggregated data in relation to COVID-19. We joined a chorus of community voices who've been calling for the collection of this data in order to address systemic discrimination, both in this moment of COVID-19 pandemic, but also more generally. I'm getting a note from Josh that there's some audio distortions. I'm not really sure what I can do about that. Would it be helpful if I tried headphones?
Headphones might help, but Kayla should be the one who...
Yeah, either headphones or if you'd like to call in.
Whichever you prefer.
Headphones is probably faster, so let's give it a go first.
All right. Just
given that I'm lost in the void trying to phone in, I'd say headphones.
Okay. Just gotta give me a second here. The joys of
also
virtual world.
It might work if you just not that you were speaking quickly, but if you speak a little extra slowly, that gives time for your word to be picked up, and then we don't miss as much of it. It only just started.
Okay. Oh, good.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Is this any better?
That is better, yeah.
Okay. Just please let me know if it gets worse. I hear that it may get worse if I lean forward. I don't usually have that problem with Zoom, but I'm not sure what's going on. So please let me know if it's still not good, and we'll figure out a different.
Sounds good now. It sounds
okay.
good now.
Okay, great. So where was I? So I was talking about the project we released, and that this was that we joined human rights commissions from across the country on calling on all jurisdictions in Canada to start collecting race-based and other disaggregated data. And that really what we were doing was echoing many years of community calls for this kind of information, but particularly in this context of COVID-19. So disaggregated data, you know, I think we have sort of a sense of what that is, but it's helpful to define. It's data that provides subcategories of information, for example, by your race, by your gender, by your age. These are sometimes called demographic categories. So unlike aggregated data, which groups information together so that we can't see the differences and how the different effects of law and policy, for example, disaggregated data can reveal inequality and relationships between categories. Disaggregated data has the potential to reveal inequalities, which can lead to structural change. When law, policy, and practice are predicated on statistics, silences and omissions in data can cost human lives. Some community members in the consultations we did this summer emphasized that statistics could be the tipping point for provincial government decision makers to take action, which was Josh's example earlier on, and I'm sure many of us indeed have had that exact experience from the civil society world. On June 16th, so following our letter and many other calls for action, the Premier invited myself and Information and Privacy Commissioner Michael McAvoy to provide recommendations on how to collect, store, use, and disclose disaggregated data in a way that furthers the aims of substantive social equality without reinforcing marginalization. And on Tuesday, my office released our report on disaggregated data, containing our recommendations to the Premier. This report both answers and echoes the calls to collect disaggregated data to advance human rights. It emerges from decades of activism, particularly from communities of color, calling for the data needed to develop policy to effectively address systemic inequalities. It calls for data that reflects the lived experiences of many and amplifies their experiences to be heard clearly by those in power who are making these decisions. While this call for data is certainly motivated by the pandemic, the problem is not limited to COVID-19, it's not limited to the health sector, and it's not limited to race and indigeneity. What we need is the collection of disaggregated data across government so that we can better address the specific needs of people based on many factors. The point here is really that we can't act on what we don't know. So as I've noted, disaggregated data has the potential to make systemic inequalities visible and to bring to light key areas where law and policy are needed or needed to evolve to remedy injustices and start to equalize power, resources, and opportunities. So for example, in 2013, the city of Ottawa conducted a study of their traffic stops, and they found that Black and Middle Eastern drivers were stopped at disproportionately high rates. After the results were released, the police service created a multi-year strategy to tackle the problem. So again, we have this example of making the problem visible in order to address it. Another example is that we know that Indigenous people are overrepresented in jails in Canada, which allows policy to be developed to address this problem. So for example, the mandating of GLADU reporting, a tool that I'm sure many are familiar with, which is used in the justice system through the sentencing process to address the problem of Indigenous people being far overrepresented in prisons. Not a full solution, but an important policy, important legal response to this systemic inequality. As useful as this evidence is for the development of good policy, the details of how this data is collected, stored, and shared is incredibly important. Data exercises or data collection exercises must not create or reinforce discrimination, bias, or stereotypes against marginalized groups as they have done in the past. So for example, Japanese British Columbians were documented, tracked, and forcibly relocated to internment camps in the interior of the province during the Second World War. Indigenous families were tracked and categorized by the federal government through the rubric of the Indian Act, and children were removed from their homes and placed into residential schools, all of which was based entirely on race-based data. In fact, the whole system of apartheid in South Africa, it was based on race-based data. So, there's some significant risks here to collecting this kind of information as well as benefits. Another significant risk is stigma. For example, the Ontario Human Rights Commission is conducting an inquiry into racial profiling by the Toronto Police Service, aka the TPS, and they have found that between 2013 and 2017, a Black person in Toronto was nearly 20 times more likely than a white person to be involved in a fatal shooting by the TPS, 20 times more likely. Despite making up less than 9% of Toronto's population, data obtained by the Commission from the Special Investigations Unit shows that Black people are overrepresented in use of force cases, shootings, deadly encounters, and fatal shootings. Black men make up 4.1% of Toronto's population, yet were complainants in a quarter of the complaints that were alleging sexual assault by Toronto Police Service officers. So knowing this data alone without any further analysis could lead to stigmatization that Black people are more likely to be a threat to police or more likely to be violent criminals, and therefore the root of the violence against them is their own behavior rather than systemic racism. But the Commission doesn't stop there in its analysis. Reports from the Special Investigation Unit reveal a lack of legal basis for police stopping or detaining Black civilians in the first place. Inappropriate or unjustified searches during encounters, unnecessary charges and arrests. The information analyzed by the Commission also raises broader concerns about officer misconduct. Courts and arms-length oversight bodies have found that TPS officers sometimes provided biased and untrustworthy testimony. They've inappropriately tried to stop the reporting of incidents of complaints about the police, excuse me, and they have failed to cooperate with the investigations of those complaints. So then we could begin to see the patterns that the violence against Black people by the police is the cause of bias of police rather than behavior of those being targeted. So this kind of causal analysis can be essential to guarding against the increased stigma of data collection against marginalized communities. So lots of potential for things to go wrong with this kind of data collection, and we've grappled with this kind of harm and how to mitigate this harm in our report and our recommendations. The underlying framework for our recommendations is that the collection of data must always be in service of systemic equality. It must be explicitly collected for that purpose, and it must always be used for that purpose alone. We had this beautiful perspective from one of our key informants in the research we did, who talked about shifting from a big brother mentality of government collecting data, monitoring citizens and using it for their purposes, to moving towards a grandmother perspective. That data is collected because we care, because government has an obligation to care for its citizens. Our lead recommendation for this report is a call for new legislation, the proposed Anti-Discrimination Data Act that would require government researchers to collect data in service of systemic equality with the meaningful involvement of marginalized communities through the use of a community governance board. A key underlying plank of all this work is that you have to build relationships with community in order to do this work. And community has to have some sense of ownership or decision-making authority over the collection, use, storage, and distribution of the information. We've said relationship is key to creating systemic change. So we recommend that the establishment with community of new data standards will define the purpose of any data collection project, will set up a respectful process, and lay out the scope and limitations of the tool with community. So how will we collect this data? What will it be used for? We are urging government to build this legislative and policy framework while also taking immediate action in some areas where there's been strong calls for data from community and some urgency to collecting that data. So for example, BC has very little information about who is being detained in mental health facilities. Understanding the demographics of that population is crucial to charting the path forward on mental health. For example, the government's recent failed attempt to introduce a new form of mental health detention for youth through Bill 22. With this report, we've crafted recommendations that center respectful relationship between policymakers and community while hopefully charting a very clear path forward for government about how to take concrete actions here to make change. So as you've heard, a couple of weeks ago was my first anniversary in this role, and I had a moment to reflect on how far we've come and how very far we have to go, both as an office, but also as a society. And as I said earlier, in my view, there's no more important time to defend human rights than in times of crisis. So this was an important moment for us to release our recommendations on one significant way we can move forward on human rights. Despite the chaos we currently find ourselves in, the sense of pending doom in many cases, I believe that the disruption of this moment has created opportunities. There is this underlying sense of hope that maybe we can come out of this better than where we started. Huge changes have happened on law and policy in very short order. Solutions that we thought were impossible have been implemented. We are in a moment, I think, to think big, to really dig deep into the structures of our government, of our policy, of how we operate as a society. So thank you for letting me share all that with you. I'm really interested to hear your comments and your questions, because I think we have some time for that now.
So I'm going to start in with a question, and then we'll get to these Q&A ones as some more come in. Commissioner Govender, your ability to tour the province was obviously curtailed by COVID. And I know that you've responded by holding town halls, province-wide video town halls, including special town halls for rural and remote communities, island communities, etc. Understanding that what you hear doesn't necessarily represent your office's position, I wonder if you can talk about some of the things you've been hearing, or just give sort of a sense of what you see as some of the particular challenges for human rights in rural, remote, and northern parts of British Columbia. So many of our advocates, as you know, serve communities in those regions.
Yes, absolutely. We've had some really interesting conversations with people across the province through these engagements. The last one for this round is actually this afternoon, and that's here in the Lower Mainland. We are, I've heard about many issues. Some of the key issues that I've been hearing about are mental health and drug treatment programs and the lack of accessibility in parts of the province to those kinds of, well, I think I've heard pretty universally actually about issues in accessing those services, but particularly in more rural parts of the province, or at least outside the Lower Mainland and on the island. So that's been a significant issue, along with the opioid crisis, significant issues around housing and access to housing, poverty issues, and interesting very strong influence on the island around disability rights. And we've certainly heard that across the province of people with disabilities talking about a whole range of issues, built environment, accessibility issues, lots about guide dogs, which we've heard not just through our consultations, but people calling our office. That's been an important learning for me coming into this role, is the nuances and the issues facing people using guide dogs. So those are some of the really key issues, but I really have heard about an entire range. Of course, hearing from a lot of Indigenous people in more northern regions and organizations representing Indigenous communities, and also about the rise of racism and hate in across the province. So some of the incidences of racism, which I think are experienced differently. Well, many human rights issues are experienced differently in communities that are more rural and remote, partly because there's much more element of interpersonal, because people know each other. So where there's those kinds of tensions, people know who's responsible, and there's a community process around that.
Thanks very much, Commissioner. There's a question from the room. It says, what is the status of the investigation in the healthcare system of the racist treatment towards First Nations people?
So we are not responsible. We are not the ones charged with doing that investigation. I think potentially partly because we didn't have our inquiry powers by the time when this issue really rose to the surface in the way that it did. So the government commissioned Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond, the former representative of Children and Youth, to take on this investigation. And I understand that her final report, that her investigation will be wrapped up in December. I understand that I believe she's working towards releasing a report in December, but I'm not sure if that timeline is really on track or not, given I think she opened up there were surveys and that she was collecting evidence from a variety of sources. But I don't have any direct insight into that, because it's not something that we were charged with taking on. on a very important issue, though. If that hadn't risen to the top in the way that it did, it was forefront of the issues we thought we might take on in an inquiry. But then because this was taken forward by Mary Ellen, we'll wait to see what happens with that report.
Thanks very much. Another question from the floor, asking if you can clarify what you mean by indigeneity. The information or data collection that you mentioned with regard to Indigenous people have been known for years and years. The question is, why has it taken the Commission so long to recognize this? I think the answer there, if I may, is that the Commission was only recreated in late 2019. But more generally, what, if anything, will the Commission put forth to address the systemic racism in the so-called child protection system, in which Indigenous children in care are so overrepresented? And indeed, as we all know, that problem has been getting worse and not getting better.
Yes, so I agree, Josh, thank you for that, that we, as the Commission, have only existed since 2019, have identified since the beginning that decolonization and the many meanings of that or many different ways that could be realized are one of our key strategic priorities. As at the same time that we identified that priority, the tribunal and actually the Human Rights Clinic, sort of all parts of the human rights system, have been working on similar issues. And so the tribunal had commissioned this report from Ardith Wacom, that report came out in January. The tribunal, just in case this question is more about what is the tribunal doing, which I think it might be, the tribunal has been actively working on implementing those recommendations, and I believe their annual report it will come out soon, and it details quite a bit of what they've been up to. So if you're interested in learning more about what concrete steps are being taken there to change tribunal processes to make it more accessible for Indigenous people and more welcoming, more useful tool, you could take a look there. As I said, one of the key recommendations that we've been working on is to change the Human Rights Code, because that's one of the systemic recommendations. Many of the recommendations of the report are really directed to the tribunal. So that's one piece. It's certainly not that this information wasn't known. I think it was known, but some of the roots of it were not well understood by the system. So that's the benefit of the report that's being produced. In terms of the child protection system, I completely agree that this is a key human rights issue in the province, and one of the key recommendations of the data collection report that I was mentioning is to broaden the kind of data that's collected through that system. So we know right now really just if people are identify as Indigenous or not, but we don't know many of the nuances of that. We don't know how many people are people of color through the system or other aspects of identity, and I think that's a significant piece of understanding the inequality there. And so it's very much on our agenda. There's one more piece here about human rights on reserve. It's not that human rights don't apply in reserve. It's just that within the reserve context, there's also the application of the Canadian Human Rights Act, and the Canadian Human Rights Commission has jurisdiction in those contexts. I have spoken out about issues that are directly related to that jurisdiction in the context of the Wet'suwet'en crisis and the conflicts that were happening there, particularly about the right to to peaceful protest in that context in January. So although it is technically outside my jurisdiction, because of the impact on people in this province, I felt like it was important to speak out about the human rights implications there and push the province to recognize that it is a human rights issue that they need to take action on.
Thanks, Commissioner. And I was going to go to the second part of the question, and you picked it up, so thanks very much. I think it's really, as confusing legally as it may be, it's important to recognize that where there's federal jurisdiction, the Provincial Commission isn't able to to get in there in the same way. Another question is that you had mentioned different categories of investigation, things that you might be looking at. I think this might have been in terms of expanding grounds, I'm not sure, but there's a question here about what you mean in relation to union membership as it connects with investigations that you might do, etc. Perhaps that's talking about grounds under the code, but you know better than what you meant than I do, so if you could clarify.
Yeah, so the Human Rights Code only covers certain areas of human interaction. So it only prohibits discrimination under the in the areas of employment, housing, so both tenancy and purchasing, services that are usually available to the public. So that includes, it's not just public services, it includes private services like stores, for example, but services that are usually open to the public or serve the public would be covered by the Human Rights Code. And then those are the three big areas. The other two areas are union membership, which is not a significant area of dispute within the code. It's not an area that we anticipate focusing on much, to be honest. And then there's a fifth area, which is called publications. As I said, that's a bit of a misnomer because that section really speaks to, well, it just speaks to discriminatory publications, but it also speaks to hate speech. So statements that are made, they could just be made orally, that contain hate. So it's another way, other than the criminal code, which many of us think hate speech, we think the criminal code. It's also prohibited in somewhat of a different way under the Human Rights Code. We're actually, when we launch this public awareness campaign, excuse me, we will later on in October be putting up some legal information to help people understand how the Human Rights Code applies to hate. I know that wasn't the question, but I'll just take the opportunity to say that. So that's how union membership fits in to the code. But as I say, I don't anticipate that being a focus of our work.
Thanks very much. Another question from the floor. This is in relation to federal legislation, so we'll completely understand if you don't feel you're able to comment on it. But the question is whether you have any comments on the impact of Bill C-92, which is a federal bill respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis authority in relation to children, youth, and families. The purpose for those listening of that bill, according to the federal government, is to affirm and recognize First Nations and Indigenous nations jurisdictions over child and family services. Obviously, there's parallel implications in both direct and parallel implications here in BC.
I don't have any real comments on this. We're not working on this issue directly. There is, though, some provincial work being done on this. Well, I think there's a lot of provincial work being done on this within the provincial government, but in terms of the watchdog role, this really is falling within the jurisdiction of the representative for children and youth. So we speak regularly and collaborate together on, we collaborated together earlier on in the pandemic about the impact of the increase on domestic violence on the rights of women and children. So there was an area of overlapping jurisdiction, but we often talk things out ahead of time and try to divide, okay, who's doing what, where is it important to echo each other, and where is there more expertise. So on this area, that's something that the representative for children and youth has extensive expertise in and is doing quite a bit of work. So I would defer to her on this one.
Thanks very much. Another one from the floor. You had mentioned the hoped for inclusion in the code of discrimination based on poverty or social condition. In rural BC, there's been a real impediment for folks trying to access government services when they don't have a computer access, and there is no Service BC office nearby. There's been work done on this by any number of organizations on service transformation at the provincial government level pre-COVID, where it resulted in huge wait times on the phone and all kinds of different things because people aren't able to do very complicated online portal type things, for example, to access welfare. And during the during the pandemic, there's been a big move, as we all know, to delivering services online. And actually quite a lot of movement now on the part of government to do that, where before even forces within government would have said, well, it's impossible, like the courts and tribunals and different sorts of things, which risks making the problems of digital exclusion worse. So I wonder if you can comment on your thoughts about digital exclusion from public services in connection with your thinking about poverty as a protected status under the code.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question to me. I think there is a connection. I also think that access to information or access to the internet to be able to access the kind of services and information that you've just spoken about, Josh, is so is a human rights issue in and of itself. And so we have been grappling with how do we tackle this issue from a human rights perspective? What's the best, I've used that expression, tools in our tool belt, but that's really where we're at on this issue, is what's the best tool in our tool belt that we can start addressing this issue? It's another one where there's complex overlapping jurisdiction between the federal government and the provincial government. So one of my considerations is, how can we, what's the best way we can make a difference on this? One of the ways that the provincial government could act on this is to consider doing an income supplement related to the access to the internet, so that people could see that more as an essential service, which we certainly do, and certainly again see it as a human rights issue. Partly it's an education piece, because clearly the person who asked this question, probably many others in the audience, can see the human rights implications of not having this kind of access. But I think the general public, that would take some work to bring people on board with that analysis. This isn't a nice to have. This isn't necessarily about access to a gaming platform. This is about access to society and the kinds of services and connections that we have with people, and that are absolutely essential in this time, particularly during COVID. So, as I say, I think it's an issue on its own that you will likely see over the next couple of years some action from our office on directly. In terms of how it relates to poverty, I think there is an analysis that could apply there if in terms of access to services. So if services are covered by the code, and if someone is not able to access those services because of one of the listed grounds, like race, for example, that could be a potential claim under the code. And again, expanding the ground of poverty would mean that if someone can't access those services because of poverty, then that could also be a claim. And so, it certainly is a possible impact of the kind of push we're putting on the provincial government to do that inclusion. I think it's a significant gap that poverty is not covered, and the worry, I think, for many is that will be floodgates will open. And while we could talk about those floodgates, there are also just some really important human rights implications that we can't deny. So how can we say we have, human rights coverage if we've left out this significant area of people's experiences?
Commissioner, I know that was a real concern from many of those in our advocacy community during COVID, and a lot of folks out there were at agencies that kept in-person hours in order to try and make sure to continue to be able to provide those services. But of course, that's a fraught. At that particular moment, and now it remains a fraud exercise. Schools as well, yeah. Right? Everyone, yeah. Which is probably an interesting hook for getting folks to think about internet access as a right. If we're going to be hanging core public services to which we have a right on having that technology, then it's hard to deny. Yeah. I have a question that's a little bit more reflective. You've covered aspects of it already, but you may wish to spend some more time reflecting on it, or you may not wish to. So my apologies. But you wrote in May that if we're, as a society, if we're successfully to challenge the manifestations of hatred and racism that we increasingly see in our everyday lives, and I say increasingly, not necessarily because they weren't always there, but there has been more coverage of it, in addition to more incidents of it, and it's hard to tease out which is which. But if we're to challenge those things, that it's important to recognize that what we see in terms of interpersonal racism, in terms of hate crimes, are actually just part of much larger systems of racism. And that's how we have to understand those incidents, as taking place within a context of power and marginalization, as you said, that are deeply entrenched in society and in the structures that we have built as a society, including the law. I wonder if you can reflect a bit further on that. You talked about when we recognize those incidents as being embedded in bigger structures, then the solutions that we see, the transformative solutions that we see, start to look different. And I wonder if you can just share some thinking on that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a much larger conversation. It's a hard thing to answer in a short form, but one example that comes to mind of the ways that we can start to dig deep on those foundations is through it's really less on the law and policy side and more on the side of kind of hearts and minds, and how do we shift attitudes and deeply held beliefs. And one of the ways that I think we do that is to encourage self-interrogation. It was one of the interesting moments I felt like from the Black Lives, that continues from the Black Lives Matter movement, is the call to educate ourselves, and that making that commitment from all colors of skin, from people with all colors of skin, to self-interrogate and start asking ourselves what biases we hold, and not feeling threatened by that conversation. And as a Human Rights Commission, one of the things that's exciting about being in this role is we can look at the full range of the ways that we make change in the world. So one of them, and the one that I'm the most familiar with, I think the one you're most familiar with, Josh, and some in the audience will be most familiar with as lawyers or legal advocates, is that shift to change how government acts. And that's extremely important. But one aspect of this problem is really broadening that and say, how do we change the behavior, all from the range of the extreme, right? The violence, and the increase in violence. I mean, the increase in violence, I think, has been there's been a real spike, and as you say, Josh, just a spike in people talking about it, but all the way to the being scared of people because they're of a certain race. So like the more nuanced aspects of racism. So that's one piece, and I think that's what our awareness campaign is really aimed at. It's really aimed at getting people to ask themselves the questions about what biases do I hold, and how do I get over that? How do I move past that? And what are the implications on other people of those biases? That these are really deeply harmful. So that's one key piece. I think the other is holding people account for racist actions, and that there are multiple ways to do that. There's, policing is certainly one way, and through the criminal justice system, but that doesn't work for many people in many communities. You need to acknowledge that. It's also got significant barriers to accessing that system through the structures that are put in place in the criminal justice system. So how can we use the human rights system to actually address these issues and hold people accountable and show people that there are repercussions for your actions? So those are some of the ways that I think we can start shifting the needle on this issue.
Thanks very much. Another question from the floor relates to, or basically posits that a majority of the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls were people who were involved in MCFD care in BC, of those who were killed or disappeared here in British Columbia. And the questioner says that their question relates to murdered and missing Indigenous women and the negligence in handling cases, I suppose, in the MCFD system because of lack of training or capacity. And is there any action that the Commission is planning on undertaking, specifically following the recommendations of the national inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls? And I would note before you answer that you're quite recognized for your work, particularly in relation to the provincial inquiry, and have been quite a leader in that in the past. So I'm sure you have thoughts about the more recent recommendations.
Yes, thank you, Josh. And in my previous role with West Coast Leaf, I did our submissions to the federal inquiry, to the or the national inquiry, I should say, into missing and murdered women. And I really appreciate this question because that was a primary point that we made in those submissions, was we have to trace through these problems and start addressing, if we're looking at root causes, one of those root causes is the way the child protection system operates, and particularly in BC. And there are concrete recommendations of going forward, not just from the Missing Women Inquiry, but also from the work of the Representative for Children and Youth, both the current representative, Jennifer Charlesworth, but also Mary Ellen Tupel-Lafond, who I've already mentioned. Under her tenure, there were a number of reports put forward examining many cases of Indigenous girls, but also the mothers of some of the children who had been killed or seriously injured in care, which is the mandate of the representative. And so I was really pushing for that in the context of the national inquiry. It is reflected in the recommendations to start to take some of those actions. One of them that I was particularly interested in pushing for, I know many people were and are around the country, is the end to birth alerts. So the end to a system in which families are given no shot at parenting. They're not given the support that I think is required under our provincial statute to support families instead of removing children where support is an option. So to back up for a second, we have a child protection system that, at least in law, says, family unification is our primary goal. Where families can be supported to keep children home, government needs to provide those supports in order to do that. We also have a system in which the vast majority who are removed from their parents' care or from their family's care are removed because of poverty-related issues, rather than because of abuse. So in all of that context, we can see there's a real disconnect between children being removed and put into a system that makes them, that really marginalizes them, that we know the evidence shows that for example, this question that children in care are more likely to be subject to violence throughout their lives. So putting them into that system because their families were poor and we're not supporting them to be able to parent and to be able to keep their children at home. One of the pieces there is to end the birth alert system in which the ministry would go into hospitals and remove children right after they were born. The ministry did end that practice, which is very good news. Unfortunately, of course, it doesn't change the fact that there are many children in care whose parents are still fighting to get them back, who were removed under that very system. So the change to ministry policy, I want to say happened this year. It was either 2020 or 2019. Time takes on a new meaning these days. But it was recent. So of course there are many children that are still young children caught up in the system who were removed in that way and support wasn't given. So that's a key issue that is still ongoing. So at least it's good to see some progress on that, but it's not enough.
We've got 5 minutes left. So maybe one last question, then we can get you out of here for the rest of your Zoom conferences throughout the day. I guess you'll just sit right there and talk to other groups for the rest of the afternoon.
Pretty much.
So during the pandemic, earlier on, you and the Representative for Children and Youth had made some statements about the unique danger posed by the pandemic for women and children living in conditions where there's family violence. And I wonder if you can comment on how you see some of those dangers and what your office calls for to help to mitigate against those. So many of the folks in our advocacy network will be some of the first people that those women deal with if and when they're able to start accessing supports.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm sure this is known more by those in the audience than me, but we know that violence has risen over this time and inevitably does rise. Well, not inevitably, that's the wrong frame, but does rise, is shown to have risen in times of crisis. And in times when there are fewer eyes on families, when there's less access to community, to schooling, we're just out of our homes more. The children are more isolated, women are more isolated, and families are under immense stress. Families are coping, families with disabilities in their families, for example, are already coping with significant issues within their family and need the social services that are there to provide support, and those were all removed. Families under significant stress. So we saw that increase in some domestic violence services pretty quickly in the province. It was equally as scary to me, to be honest, on those services where we saw a decline in services, or decline in calls, a decline in people trying to access those services. And that was one of my real worries. We know that violence is increasing, but if people aren't calling for help, that means we're going to see more people seriously harmed by this if women and young people are not able to leave their homes. So one of the calls for action that we had was to try to get that information out there, to try to raise awareness that this is that there are services still available, that they're available to serve you virtually or to serve you if you are able to leave your home, and to get that out in a way that would acknowledge that for many people who are victims in this context, they have even less privacy now. So they're less able to find those services, less able to use the computer in a private setting, and so on. So we wanted that information to be more publicly accessible, and we were very pleased to see the public health officer and the Center for Disease Control start adding that information to some of the daily announcements from the public health officer, our daily updates, as well as the page of the CDC, so the COVID page that has that kind of information. So we were like, if people can be part of accessing health information, can be accessing the information about anti-violence services. So that's certainly one way. Another way is to, reflecting on our conversation about technology, is to try to get women and young people access to technology so that they can reach out when they need to. So there was a real call for burner phones. That was somewhat of a less successful call, although I don't have a recent update on that, so perhaps folks in the audience know more about that. And access and calls for increased funding. I know many organizations were calling for that change, and I know there was some increased funding as a result. So those were some of the actions that flowed from that call.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Govender, for being so generous with your time today in speaking to us and taking our questions. We're just so pleased to be able to hear from you. And I, for one, am very grateful for the work that you and your ever-growing team are doing and will be doing for folks living in these lands known as British Columbia. So thanks very much. And I hope you have a super day. And I don't have a Law Foundation branded blanket to hand you right now or a water bottle, but suffice to say, we're very grateful that you made it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Josh. I have been using my Law Foundation branded water bottle throughout the pandemic. Have no fear. Thank you to you, Josh, and thank you, Lois, for the invitation. And thank you again to everybody working on these issues and listening today.
Thank you. And before everybody rushes for the door, I was thinking we could probably put the link for that report up by your materials, if that would be, can we arrange to do that? The report.
It's on their website, so we can do that.
Okay, it's on the website. Okay, and that's there. And also, please, participants, there's a chance to do an evaluation. It wouldn't be in Law Foundation event if you didn't have an evaluation sheet. It comes up automatically at the end of each session, and it comes up again at the end of the day. So 2 chances. Thank you very much, Kasari and
Thank you.
Josh and Mark.